So we want to put all our evidence together that we've looked at in the past 21 readings. Start out the teachings of Jesus. Right? From the very beginning, we see that Jesus lived and taught his disciples the principles of conduct that ruled out all violence. Right? All use of violence and injury against others. That very fact implies that Christian participation in war is right. Because how can you participate in war without violence, injury? Now, we saw that those principles that he set up, those are only meant for his followers. Right? This small but growing group of his disciples, not for all of unredeemed humanity. Right? He didn't expect everyone the next day to start following all his teaching. It's a gradual process. We noticed also that those non-resistance teachings, you don't use force, but there's a positive counterpart. Right? Because those who are using force, they're not helpless, they're not useless. Right? They're very effective in controlling sin in other ways. Guiding people, teaching people to do right, being good examples to people. They don't need to be forced to do anything themselves. Right? So there's a positive shift. Now, we saw that there are several attempts that were made to get around these teachings. Right? They say, well, Jesus just wants us to follow the spirit of the law, not the letter. It doesn't play out. The idea that there's some law for a perfect society doesn't make sense either, because in a perfect society there wouldn't be wrongs to endure, there wouldn't be enemies to have, to love. All those different things, they rested on false assumptions. That intramethic theory that, well, the world's about to end, so that's why Jesus believes those things, right? No. Doesn't work. You look at the early Christians, and they took Jesus at his word. And they obeyed those things that he taught literally. And they took them all in a very literal sense. The teachings of gentleness, non-resistance. They closely identified themselves with peace. Christianity was the religion of peace. They strongly condemned war because of bloodshed. They would have nothing to do with it. Now, they believed that Christianity fulfilled that Old Testament prophecy about turning your weapons of war into agricultural tools, right? Swords into plowshares, spears into sickles, right? They said, that's about us. That's what's happening now. It was their policy that they declared not to return evil for evil, or to conquer evil with good. They only conquered evil with good. Okay? With a few possible exceptions, right? There was no Christian soldier, no Christian joined the church, no soldier joined the church and remained a soldier until about 170 AD. And we know that even at that time, based on the complaints of Celsus, that it was common for Christians not to serve in the army at all, to refuse to serve. We know that because of the writings of Tertullian, about 200 AD, that many soldiers did leave the army whenever they converted to Christianity. That was a common choice. And those records in about 200 AD, that's the first instance that we see any evidence of people who had already become Christians becoming soldiers after their conversion. $150 years after the Book of Acts. There was a general distrust of being a soldier because of ambition. You know, You're in it for the greed or the glory. And people had a problem with idolatry. You know, they didn't want to be contaminated by the idolatry that was involved in being in the army. But an equally large objection was their objection to bloodshed. The connection of the army to imprisoning, torturing, and wounding, and killing, that didn't match up with the teachings of Jesus. There were church orders that ruled large parts of the Christian church in that time, even in the 3rd century and beyond, that forbid a Christian soldier forbid a soldier or a magistrate to become a Christian. They had to abandon their calling before they were able to be baptized. And if a Christian became part of the army, according to those orders, they were to be excommunicated until they repented with weeping, confessions, lamentations. Now, Origenes, he was a great thinker of his day. Maybe one of the greatest thinkers that the church had for generations. And he tried to answer a lot of these questions that Celsus had, and a few other things. Now, he wasn't concerned about those end time things, you know, that, the world is coming to an end pretty soon. He didn't even think that. Right? His all arguments were not framed in this idea that it's all about idolatry. Right? He was against bloodshed. And he would not, he said Christians generally refuse to serve in the army because of that. Right? Because of bloodshed. And he defended that. Right? And he defended the Christian views with some very good arguments. Especially talking about the positive influence that they have. Right? And the ideas that, you know, the Romans, they let their priests not serve in the army because they have a duty to their gods. But what about the Christians? Let our military service be like that of the priests. Because that's the kind of people we are. We have a relationship with God. Right? If you look back at the history, no church writer before Athanasius, that's in 350 AD, some 30, 40 years after Constantine. No Christian writer before that ever ventured to say that it was permissible or praiseworthy to kill enemies in war. Without the qualification, right? There was an exception if you were a pagan. They were talking about pagans. Well, they talked about righteous wars and battles and admirable traits of soldiers and things like that. But for Christians, it was out of the question until 350 and later. After that, things really started to change. You think of the conditions of the early Christians. Right? It really kept them from thinking about these things. They didn't have to apply this idea for a really long time. Right? Because Jews didn't serve in the army. Slaves couldn't serve in the army. The emperor could get all the soldiers he needed from volunteers. So there was no way that any Christian was going to be forced to join the army. He'd have to do it by his own choice. And if everybody around you says, hey, that's not a good idea, then that's generally not going to happen very much. But as time goes by, things change. You consider that there's no definite ruling, right? There's no opportunity to apply it for a really long time. People's thoughts, they start to wander, right? Other factors start to come in and become more important in their decision making. Because Jesus never said directly, don't be a soldier. You start thinking some of the other sins that Christians have a problem with. Serving as a soldier is not like committing adultery. Right? For Christians, adultery was wrong, but adultery was also wrong for the pagans. Everybody considered that. So that was easy. Idolatry. Christians were always against idolatry, right? But idolatry was a very common problem. Everybody dealt with idolatry, right? Not everybody was going to be a soldier. So you also have the fact that the army, the military, is also the police, right? Which means they're responsible for administering justice, maintaining law and order. Well, we like those things. We like law and order, right? Law and order don't necessarily involve bloodshed. So if you're okay with that side of it, you might say, well, I can be in the army because there's some jobs that I can do that aren't bad, right? And you think back, and the Christians are the metaphors of things, right? They're very fond of using military metaphors and thinking of themselves as soldiers, right? Soldiers for Christ in this spiritual war that we're fighting against evil. And so if you're used to thinking of yourself like that, well then, it doesn't take too much to start changing the spiritual into the physical. You get a few generations away. The scripture obviously taught them to respect these warriors of old, right? David and Samson and all these guys who were heroes of faith. They acted under the approval and the guidance of God. They, at the same time, are looking forward to a time where Christ is going to come back and destroy all these evil people and lead his armies. You know, it might have been an angelic army or something, but still, that affects kind of your thinking. How exactly you feel about it. And in the meantime, you know, they could think about war being divine chastisement and punishment on these evil people here and evil people there. The Romans punishing the Jews because they did these terrible things to Christ and they didn't follow the laws, and this happening and that happening. That's how they saw the thing in AD 70, that war was a divine punishment of the Jew. You know, they were told to think of the emperor, right? To respect him, to honor him. He's appointed by God for the purpose of checking sin, for maintaining order. The emperor can't maintain order if he doesn't have his armies. Right? Now, none of those things, you can believe all those things, you can think all those things without thinking that you have to serve in the army yourself, or that you have a right to. You know? Those things don't necessarily conflict with the idea of peacefulness for Christians. But, like we said, if there's no definite ruling, and nobody really had to deal with the problem for a long time, then slowly, things start to come in, things start to get complicated. And nobody can say, well, war is 100% wrong all the time, so you can't be a soldier. Right? For everything that you do as a soldier is against God's will. No, you could be a soldier if you're very careful about what you did, and maybe when you went to war you didn't really kill anybody. There's some considerations there. And Tertullian kind of talks about that with magistrates, but it's kind of ridiculous. Why are you going to be a soldier if you can't do any of the things that soldiers do? Why are you going to be a magistrate if you can't do anything that they do? We saw that because of that, because of all these thoughts, and because of the fact that Christians in the army, right, were becoming, or people in the army were becoming Christians, right? There might be some motivation for them to stay. So even from the very earliest of times, there's a possibility of Christian soldiers. Okay. We also have to remember that a lot of the early Christians were pretty simple-minded, right? They weren't the wisest of folk. They didn't always make the most logical decisions. We saw that some of their arguments for joining the army was because John the Baptist had a leather belt, and Aaron had a buckle. That's not a good argument. They're not arguing on the fact that we need to defend peace and justice, but because he had a belt. There's also the scripture, right, that Paul says, I think, let everyone remain in the calling wherein he's called. Okay? So whatever your position you're in, when you become a Christian, stay in the position. That might have a certain appeal to soldiers, right? Because it doesn't rule out soldiers, right? In and of itself, it doesn't rule out anything. And so if you're a soldier, and if you try to quit the army because you're a Christian, you might be killed. Give up. So if you can just stay in and kind of avoid things or do whatever, then that's okay. Right? And you've got this backing you up. But just because it says, let everyone remain in the calling where he's called, that doesn't mean you can just keep doing whatever you were doing. If you're a prostitute and you become a Christian, does that mean you can continue being a prostitute because of that? Clearly not. Right? There are some exceptions to that. So we've got to go back to those general principles of Jesus. Also, if you consider these soldiers who become Christians, they might not realize how bad the situation is. Because they've been a soldier all their life. They're used to all the things that they have to do, right? These grim duties, and they've always considered themselves to have an honorable profession, right? So why would their views suddenly change? You have to also consider that Christians are pretty tolerant. This whole fact that they're taught to be gentle and not stand up and fight and all this, that we might not be so confrontational to some guy who wants to be a soldier, right? Especially since, at least in the beginning, there's not very many of them, right? It doesn't happen very often. And maybe we're in a peaceful place and he doesn't really have to do anything bad. We might think, well, now there's a Christian in the army, We've got a banner for God in the devil's camp. He can be an influence for good in that horrible place. Okay? So they could be happy. Also, civilians don't really know how horrible war is. Right? They don't really think about it very much. And so, just the general Christian friend might not realize that there's a problem with this friend being a soldier. He might recall the teachings of Jesus, but you can make some excuses, right? But the problem is that a Christian can stay a soldier, right? If he's a soldier and he becomes a Christian and it's okay for him to stay in the army, well, that means it should be okay for a Christian who's not in the army to join the army. Because if you can be in the army and be a Christian, then you can be in the army and be a Christian. And if there can be one, then there can be 2, and 3, and 5, and 100, and 1,000. Right? And so because the people weren't really in a position to object at first, and there were some different things, the problem gets bigger and bigger. And then, when you get to the time of Constantine, right? Well, now the ruler of the empire is saying that Jesus told him to do this. And he's fighting for Christ. And now we're set free from all this persecution. Right? So you can see that, in the early years, it was slowly becoming a problem. Right? It didn't really dawn on anybody that, hey, this is going to be a big problem later. Right? It wasn't a decision very many people had to make. You could say that the simple-mindedness of some, right, the worldliness of others, the charitable tolerance of the rest, not necessarily approval, right? But I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt that you're not going to do what's wrong. All those things were silently determining what was going to happen. Right? And so then when Constantine comes in and he wins, and he sets Christianity free, basically, well, now the church has to come down on one side or the other. Are we going to be on his side? Or are we going to be against him? Are we going to serve him in the army or not? She didn't really have a choice anymore. Because for so many, it had already been made. And if it's okay for them, then that's kind of what happens in a lot of things in life. You know? It gets to the point where I don't want to say anything because why didn't I say something sooner? Right? And so, because Constantine had set them free and everybody was so happy, right? The church really became the official position was the sanction of war, right? But unfortunately, it wasn't just that the church now is going to, Christians will go and fight for justice and do this and that, but they have to do whatever the emperor tells them. Because he's the emperor, right? And so Christians did horrible, horrible, horrible things. So it's really difficult to resist the impression that the church took a false step in throwing away that earlier strictness that they had. Because over time things just get less and less pure. And it's very, very interesting. By the time Constantine was about 310, 312, something like that. 100 years after that, 411, non-Christians weren't allowed to serve in the army anymore. The army was 100% Christian within 100 years. So there's a big change that happened in that generation. But even then, it wasn't unanimous. We still see those church orders in effect. There's people fighting against it, but what can you say? Ivan? Because that's the official position of the church. Now, if you go against that, you're a heretic. Ivan? And so for centuries, no one could even talk about it. And today, we have all these traditions that have come down in this way of life. That's all devoted to these ideas. And so we have to ask ourselves, is there something different in the world today that makes this testimony of these early Christians invalid? Right? Because we live in a bit of a different world, right? But what is there that's different? Right? Is bloodshed suddenly okay? Right? Do we have some duty to society that the early Christians didn't really have? We've already seen that the Christian can do great good for the society without serving in the army, serving in the government. Right? So I have to consider all those things. For me, the answer to our question, should Christians go to war, is no. And that's been the answer of many for a long time. But unfortunately, it's not the answer of most. So I ask you to consider the evidence and decide. Do what you think.